and breast cancer survival by PAM50 subtype. As brief overview, I'm going to present the background that motivated this particular research, as well as the findings and conclusions from the current study. This is a long-standing, persistent finding that Black women happen to have lots of researchers have done a considerable number of studies to try to illuminate the underlying factors that explain this disparity. And some of the factors that do explain some of the variability in this difference include stage of diagnosis, treatment differences, comorbidity differences, as well as aggressiveness of tumors. However, some researchers have found that even among those women with the uniform stage, same treatment, and similar follow-up, that Black women still happen to have worse prognosis after a diagnosis. And this particular research has led some researchers to hypothesize that it is the worse breast cancer subtypes that Black women tend to get, the less treatable, more aggressive subtypes, that may help to explain this disparity. However, we could find no published data that happened to test this particular hypothesis. So in over 1,200 white women, 132 Black, 142 Latina, and 154 Asian and Pacific Islander women from the Kaiser Permanente Northern California population, and these were women from the LACE and the Pathways studies, we selected women with all cases, and then among the luminal A subtypes, we did a random sample of 500 women with those particular tumors, and that was based on the IHC classification. Data was collected based on questionnaires as well as electronic medical data, and then as far as getting the PAM50 breast cancer subtype, we took 1 millimeter punches from the formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tumor blocks, and then examined expression of PAM50 genes for molecular subtype determined by R2-qPCR of extracted RNA. And then because of the way we selected this particular group of women, we did case cohort methods of analysis. Similar to previous studies, we found that Black women did have a lower odds of the luminal A subtype, the more common, more easily treatable subtype. And then similarly, Black women were more likely to have the basal-like subtype compared with the luminal A subtype. However, adjusted for breast cancer subtype, in addition to a variety of other potential covariates, we found that Black women happen to have a significantly higher rate of recurrence after breast cancer diagnosis, and they also had a 71% elevated risk of breast cancer death post-diagnosis. By contrast, Latina women happen to have a 45% reduced risk of recurrence. We didn't have a lot of power to examine this by subtype because of the few number of Black, Latina, and Asian women in this particular study. However, we wanted to get a sense of whether the elevated mortality was restricted to a certain subtype or a couple of subtypes of breast cancer. And what we found, in contrast with that particular hypothesis, that Black women happen to have a higher rate of mortality for all of the subtypes. The basal-like, they were the closest. They had about a 30% elevated risk. But for the other subtypes, they had a more than twofold risk of breast cancer mortality. In conclusion, Black women had worse breast cancer survival regardless of the PAM50 subtype, whereas Latina women had a lower risk of recurrence. And our findings seem to indicate that the worst survival is regardless of subtype. This research, though in a large population, needs to be replicated in a larger group, and then more research needs to be done to illuminate why this disparity continues to persist. I want to thank my collaborators, and I want to thank you, and I also want to thank the National Cancer Institute for making this research possible.
Yeah, thank you, Candice. There are prejudice is about cancer in general, and prejudice is about cancer in particular ethnical groups. And some of these prejudices are really based on genetic basis, and we start learning and discerning what is happening there. One of these knowledge is that, in fact, black people tend to do worse in many tumor types, not only in breast cancer, but also prostate and others, lung. And in breast cancer, though, there's a little bit more data than in the other tumor types. And I think that these data that Candyce just presented are important because at least start shedding some light to potential situations that may happen more commonly in breast cancer in black people. And one is, in fact, a greater likelihood of less treatable basal subtype, and potentially, though, the fact that even across all the different subtypes, that the mortality is higher in African Americans, and this is not easily explainable. I think there may still be some social aspect that would add to that, but I think studying the genetics and what is really happening in this tumor will be essential if we want to understand why there are disparities between ethnical groups. And I think this is an important study, although it is based on a relatively small sample set of only about 130 some black women. And I think, as Candyce said, we should have a bigger data set in which these data should be try to be reproduced. But this is an exquisitely important question that we have to answer. So I think that we can open now for questions.